Greetings and salutations, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome once again to the Storyteller's Corner. I'm your host, Joshua T. Culkins Truici, also known as Byron Insidious. The other day, on both my X and my Facebook account, I put up a brief little post, just an observational thing about my own fantasy works, mentioning that I had noticed that early on in my career as a fantasy storyteller, especially in my Temerarian Tales novels and short stories, that I had written most of my early works from the 5th age of Temeraria utilizing a kind of a hard magic system, but that over time, as I continued telling stories and improving in my craft, and then shifting to the 4th age Temerarian Tales, that I had kind of altered my approach and begun utilizing a mostly soft magic system, and that I've actually become fond of using a soft system. And one of my longer time acquaintances on Facebook said, well, that's neat, but just for clarification, what's the difference? What's a hard magic system versus a soft magic system? And I realized I myself have watched/listened to numerous YouTube videos where people discuss the difference between the two, but I had never really taken a swing at approaching this subject within the genre of fantasy myself. So this is kind of my taking a swing at defining the difference between a hard magic system as opposed to a soft magic system. In a hard magic system in fantasy genre literature, and you see it a lot in tabletop role-playing games and even in some video games of fantasy type, a hard magic system employs a lot of guidelines, strictures, and formulas for the usage of magical abilities. There are specific spells that require a very finite number of movements, incantations, and or consumable material components to be utilized in the completion and activation of certain spell effects. For instance, in the 5th age Temerarian Tales, especially my first few, magic users tended to be of a particular type or a class, similar to tabletop role-playing systems. Unlike things like Dungeons and Dragons, where you had, wizards versus sorcerers versus mages, in my early Temerarian works, there were elementalists of specific types like pyromancers, gaiamancers, aeromancers, and aquamancers, similar to something you might see out of the popular Avatar: The Last Airbender series, where benders, except for the avatar himself or herself, focused on or had capacity only for one type of bending, one type of power. There was also Q mages in the Temerarian Tales. There were shaman who specifically focused on ritual magic, illusionists, necromancers, and they were confined to utilizing powers, spells, and abilities of those types. I even utilized a similar system in the Kathy Potts Realms of Aether novels. A King, or a Midwestern Yankee in King Ovin's Court, The Chained One, and Kingdom No More, though I started to utilize more soft magic mechanics in that story. In a hard magic system, you also find that there are limitations clamped down not only on the type of magic that a particular wielder of magic can utilize, but they have limitations on things like the number of spells they can cast in a given period of time before they require rest or recharging the batteries, as it were. They need to eat, they need to sleep, they need to meditate or rest or regain a certain number of physical components to perform a ritual for a spell. There's a very formulaic approach to the use of magic in a hard magic system. In a soft magic system, magic is a little bit more loosely defined and loosely structured. There is still the requirement to utilize magical energies, or mana, mana is a fairly generic term utilized across the fantasy genre. You find it in things like Magic the Gathering, tradable card game. You find it in video games where you have magic points or mana pools. There is a limitation on how much magical energy you can expend, but the way in which it is recovered tends to be a little bit more loosely defined. How much access specific mages or magic-wielding characters in the narrative. They have variable amounts or capacities for accessing mana or magical energy. And the uses, the applications of magic and spellwork or spellcraft aren't as clearly and rigidly defined. For instance, again, using my own work as an example, in The Glove of Shadows, which I am currently presenting in its chapter-by-chapter format on the storytellerscorner.substack.com. Self-plug. Self-plug within a self-plug. Hey, the book's entirely available in whole over on Amazon or Barnes & Noble as well. The character of Lane McNeely, a member of the Midnight Suns, she is a necromancer. She raises the dead. She manipulates the dead. She utilizes necrotic energies and rot and decomposition and decay. She also, her spellcraft and abilities as a magic wielder of that type in Temellaria can focus on controlling creatures like insects and vermin or rodents typically associated with disease and plague and rot, unhealthiness. This is the work of a necromancer in Temellaria. And that's what she solely focuses on. It's all I touch upon her utilizing throughout the story wherein she appears. As opposed to in Strange Campfellows, which was the first novel I published of the Fourth Age of Temellaria, the character of Memnoch Halkesh, she is a mage with the Freelancers Guild of Temellaria, but she utilizes her magic in a much more experimental fashion. She utilizes spells that are focused on putting up protective perimeters for the camp, shielding or adding protection against projectile weaponry or assaults for herself and her allies. She also utilizes spellcraft to move objects, to enlarge or shrink them temporarily. She utilizes magic to discern the layout of the area ahead by utilizing something referred to as a feeler, which is a kind of magical probe that she can send her visual and auditory and olfactory sensory inputs into and send it forth away from her so that she can scout ahead through this kind of spectral tentacle or floating presence that allows her to observe a distance away from her own physical body. But she also casts forks of lightning from her hands, as well as jags of ice She can call down from the skies above. Her magic is not limited to a singular type of elemental attack or assault, but she also has access to some limited healing spells. She's not as well versed in the art of healing through magic, but she's much more of a jack of all trades, much more experimental. And there are no specific names of spells that she invokes. I ended up relying on a much more softened approach to magic, where, yes, there are limitations to what she can do, but they're not hard and fast laws or rules. There's less definition, a little bit more mystery involved. Magic should be mysterious in a soft magic system. There can be higher powers, yes, but they tend to be a little less definitive. Part of what I enjoy about utilizing a soft magic system is that the reader, as well as myself as the storyteller, the writer of the work, gets to kind of play around with one's own imagination to try and just imagine what's possible if a particular character has access to a large enough pool of magical energy. The possibilities are quite literally fairly limitless. That's all I really meant when I said I've been using more soft magic, and I've taken a shine to it, because it does allow for a much greater variety of spell works and effects to be available to specific characters. Now, don't get me wrong. I think having a hard magic system, having guidelines and rules and preconceived capacities or limitations can be done very well in the hands of a talented storyteller. If you have to work within certain parameters or guidelines, how you're able to work within them can show a deftness and capacity for storytelling far beyond even what your freewheeling, I can do anything I want narrative can conjure up, because it shows the deployment of mastery of the language and the art of the written word. If you need an example, I would turn you to the works of Timothy Zahn when he wrote Heir to the Empire for Star Wars. He had canon and lore, mythology, was previously established that he had to work within the confines of. And he did so. And he did so masterfully. So just because you've got guidelines or restrictions doesn't mean you can't prove to be a wonderfully talented storyteller. So hard magic systems can be great if you know what you're doing. And soft magic systems can also be wonderful, again, if you know what you're doing. And I certainly hope that I have proven over the years that I know what I'm doing, and I hope you folks are willing to give me a chance to prove that I know what I'm doing. Head on over to thestorytellerscorner.substack.com, or head on over to Amazon or barnesandnoble.com and search out the works of one Joshua T. Calkins trilogy. And I'm hoping to prove to you, dear reader or listener, that I know a bit about telling a story, whether it be in an established canon or in my own new independent works. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you for tuning in. Thank you for listening. I ask that you take care of yourselves, and as always, keep reading.